Today, we have a wonderful gentleman, Jeff Walker, from Vassar College. He teaches earth science there, and he's the John Burroughs expert. And I have to say that he looks a lot like John Burroughs. You just need the hat.
I know. I never have found the right hat.
And Jeff's going to give us a lot of information today about this wonderful gentleman who built Slabsides in 1895.
Yes. Good for you.
Yeah.
I had to look it up.
Okay. Well, that time period is really kind of special for ambassadors who are docents on the bridge, because in 1899, that's when this bridge was built, the original railroad bridge. So for me, all these connections are wonderful when you hear something that happens at the same time. So my vision is, the railway bridge being built, John Burroughs getting so involved in his work, and building Slabsides is all the one, So for me, that makes this very important. So I want to thank Jeff for coming today, and I hope you all learn and enjoy the presentation about John Burroughs, and I'll pass it off to Jeff.
Thank you, Shirley. Okay, so John Burroughs. John Burroughs was a nature writer at the turn of the 20th century, as Shirley just said. He actually moved to the Hudson Valley in 1872, and that was right after his first book of nature essays was published. He lived, and then he built, he not only built Slabsides, which many people might be familiar with, he also built his family home, which was called Riverby, which is right across Route 9 from where you drive up the Slabsides. It's privately owned now, and it's pretty much all grown up around it, so you can't even hardly see it from the road. But that was his home till he died in 1921. So for 50 years, just about, Burroughs called the Hudson Valley his home. And so what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit about Burroughs' life and his writings, and then talk about a couple of his essays and how in those essays his ideas about the Hudson River were evolving, because it's pretty interesting. Okay, so I'll give you a biography a little bit. I'll talk about, he did some traveling. He wasn't a huge traveler. He wasn't like John Muir, who did a lot of traveling. But when he did, he wrote about the Hudson Valley often when he was in England, or when he was in Alaska, or when he was in Jamaica. The Hudson Valley was, once he moved here, it was really, he felt his home, and he was continually comparing it. I want to tell you about a resource that you all can use, because the journals of John Burroughs have now been digitized, and they're available through the Vassar library. And I'll say a few words about that. And then I want to talk about one article in particular about the Hudson River itself. This was an article that we can trace from his journals into a magazine article, and then into a book, anthologized into a book. And there are lots of changes that happen along the way, which are pretty interesting. And then finally, I want to tell you about a new project we're working on in the Catskills that I'm working on with a forester named Mike Kudish. So Burroughs was born in Roxbury. Roxbury's just sort of north of Arkville. It's just on the other side of the of the pass there on Route 28. That's a picture of the house. Said that to the pointer here, yeah. If I can get it to hit something. Oh, it doesn't hit the screen. Anyway, that's a picture of the house and the barn. It was a dairy farm, and in fact, they were as a family. He was the seventh of 10 kids, so it was a pretty big family, and they were pretty much self-sufficient. They made a little bit of money, and that money was made from butter. And twice a year, they'd take all the butter tubs that they had made and take them by wagon down, I think it was in the Saugerties, where the butter buyer would buy them, and that would give them the only income really off the farm. Other than that, they made or grew or just about everything they ate or wore there. And you can see, actually, just how cleared out the area is around it. This area in the Catskills now has been pretty well reforested. When he was 17, he began a life as an itinerant teacher. He loved to read. He loved to learn stuff, and this was a good job for him. He wasn't very good at it, though, apparently. He seems to have taught at one or sometimes two schools in the same year. So I think he did one term, and then either he didn't like it or they didn't like him. We don't really know. But anyway, he moved on quite a few times. But I mean, he taught a lot of different places. The farthest out he taught was out in Illinois. He taught as far south as Highland Falls, down by West Point. And in fact, at West Point in the library is where he began. He first saw Audubon's Book of Birds and got really interested in birds. He knew, interested in learning how to identify birds. He knew birds, but he didn't know how to identify them. And then through Audubon, he realized you could identify them. In 1857, he married his wife, Ursula. She is someone that he met at the school teachers in those days would live with various farm families while they were teaching. And she was the farmer's daughter, had one of those there, and they developed a relationship. But then in 1863, he was looking for more certain income. He'd been married, as you see, he'd been married now for 6 years. During that time, they hardly had ever lived together because she lived with her parents and he lived wherever he was teaching. He moved to Washington, D.C., and he got a job with the Treasury Department and as a guard of a vault of banknotes or something like that. And it was a really good job for him because he didn't have to do very much. And so he could sit at his desk and he could write. And this is where, he always did like to write before this, but this is where it really began. He did a lot of writing in this time. At the time, he was imitating some of the popular, well, sort of popular writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalists, kind of ethereal, almost dreamy stuff there. But then he met Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman was anything but dreamy in that sense there. Walt Whitman liked the real thing. And he said, Johnny, you know what you should do? You should write about what you know, and write about your, birds, write about your boyhood in the Catskills. And he started doing that. And immediately he was able to start selling essays to various magazines. Like the Atlantic Monthly is about the only one that's still around, but there was one called Century Illustrated and Scribner's. He could sell them to them, and he developed a real following for his nature essays. So it was primarily on the encouragement of Walt Whitman. And then in 1872, he moved to the Hudson Valley, and he built this house. This is Riverby. Like I say, if you slow way down just right there by, in West Park, you can just barely see the house through the trees. But at the time he built it, there were no trees there. It was on this bluff overlooking the river, quite a spectacular location. And so he lived there until the end of his days, as I said. But after a while, then 1895. So that's about 23 years later. He also built this house, Slabsides, which maybe you're familiar with because it's open to the public and you can walk there. And it's anything but prominently displayed on the bluffs of a river. In fact, it's on that rock. Right next to that rock is a swamp. There's a 3-acre swamp right there. So his ideas about houses changed, and that parallels his ideas about the Hudson River. A lot of famous people visited him at Slabside. John Muir was one of the first guests after they'd finished it. Teddy and Mrs. Roosevelt also visited there. And then in 1908, he purchased a house which was on the ancestral farm back up in the Catskills. And so he remodeled that, and he called it Woodchuck Lodge because there were woodchucks in his garden all the time. And so at this time, he was also friends with folks, with kind of the industrialists of the time, Ford, Firestone, Edison. And in fact, Henry Ford helped him to purchase some of the land there, some of the land that was being mortgaged. Henry Ford helped pay that off, so they were good friends that way. And so he died then in 1921. He actually was not at home when he died. He was trying to get home. He was on a train from California. And I think it's somewhere in the middle of Ohio. On the train, he died. So he was trying to get back to the Hudson Valley. Okay, so let's talk about his writings. He probably wrote 400 or 500 essays that may have been published in all kinds of different things. But after a while, he was able to collect a certain set of essays and put them into a book. And so, as you can see there on the upper right-hand corner, these are the collected works of John Burroughs, all those books. So I think there's 23 there, including books that he edited. He was published probably 25 or 26 books in his time. The first book was published, as I said, in Washington, D.C. Then he moved to Riverby, where he published another eight books. I guess this doesn't really work there, but in the second column, second one down, Signs and Seasons, 1886. By that time, he was famous enough as a writer that he could make most of his income from writing. The other thing he did at Riverby was to farm grapes. And that between writing and farming, that was his total income. And that was really his goal. So it took him a little while, but he made it to then. And from then on, he was just known as a writer and as a farmer. Table grapes. When he built Slabsides, he ended up writing another set of books, another 8 books. And then in Woodchuck Lodge, there's another 8. So he was quite prolific in his thoughts. You'll notice I wrote up here a little bit about what each set of books can kind of be characterized by, and early on it's just nature writing, but as he goes on, he gets more philosophical, and as he gets older, I mean, you can even tell by the names of the books. If you look in the Woodchuck Lodge period there, The Summit of the Years, Accepting the Universe, he's really thinking more about philosophy than birds at that time. So let me mention some of the trips that he took and some of the essays that came out of them and how the trips came about. In 1871, he went to England for the first time, and he was essentially a treasury guard. They were taking a bunch of treasury notes to England, and he and 2 other guards were sent along to make sure that nobody stole them on the boat, I guess. While he was there, though, he did a lot of observing, but most of his observations were comparing it. He was comparing the farming to the farming that we did here at that time. He was most familiar with the Catskills, but it's pretty interesting to see that he really believed, and this is sort of in distinction with John Muir. He really believed that the best landscape was a more cultivated landscape. The English countryside, to him, was a beautiful landscape. Muir, as you know, he liked the wild and the untamed, essentially. Now, on the strength of that book, he was then commissioned by the publisher to go back to England in 1882 and write a whole series of essays about that. He also traveled to Alaska in 1899, and at that time he was traveling with Muir. That's a picture of him standing near a glacier with Muir, and published an essay called In Green Alaska. But the interesting thing is that, I mean, he talks about stopping in Juneau, and they're walking around Juneau, and he sees, there's this lady selling eggs, and he goes up, to talk to her, and he's more interested really in the fact that she has robins in the backyard, and that the flowers that are blooming are the same flowers that were blooming in the Hudson Valley, 3 weeks ago, or something like that. He's, like I say, he's always comparing life in the Hudson Valley with wherever he is. Well, he went to Jamaica, and you can tell by the name of that essay that he didn't have a very good time in Jamaica. Well, and the reason is that he found a tropical forest to be just prickly, and everything was just, he could not feel comfortable in that, and so he called it a lost February. He was there for a whole month with his son Julian. He went to Yellowstone with Roosevelt. That's a picture of him there with Roosevelt. Interesting thing about this was they traveled across the country by train. And of course, being the president, you had to stop at every town, and wave to everybody. Well, it turned out in some towns, Burroughs was more important or more well known than was Roosevelt. That was Burroughs' impression. I don't know what Roosevelt thought. He also went to Yosemite with John Muir, and he also went to Hawaii on another one, commissioned trip. And by then, he felt much better about tropical. I think it was more the climate than the landscape there. So one of the real resources we have around, well, now that it's on the internet, everybody has, is the fact that his journals, he started keeping a journal when he built the house, so 1872, and he kept the journal until 1921. So we have almost 50 years of journal entries. And he would write almost every day, so there's lots and lots and lots of entries there. They were given to Vassar College by his granddaughter, Betty Kelly, and I guess I didn't date this, but at some point, the college made digital copies of all the journals, and then I started, and then I started getting students to do it because it was a lot of work. We started creating a transcript of them. So now you can see both what he wrote and then a transcript of it. And if you're interested in it, if you think if you just see that nyheritage.org, that is the absolute easiest way. If you go to that site and then search for John Burroughs journals, you'll find it there. Okay, so this is an example of his journal and then of our transcription of it. And this actually is relevant to what I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I'm going to read down through it so that just so you can get a feel for his writing and his penmanship and his writing. So it says, finished my, and then it's crossed out, but it says observations of nature, crossed out, and he added on top of it signs and seasons today. Begun 2 weeks ago. This is a great observation. Writing is like fishing. He loved to fish. I'll talk about that in a minute there. You do not know that there are fish in the hole until you have caught them. I did not know there was an article in me on this subject till I fished it out. I tried many times before I had a bite, and I've done much better sometimes than others. Now, I don't know if you can notice, if you can see, but in the second line of the handwritten journal, the word done is crossed out and it's corrected. So this is the reason we were doing the transcription, because the original transcription was done by his literary executrix, Clara Barris, and for some reason she didn't want people to hear John Burroughs the way he wrote. She wanted to correct stuff. So she would periodically correct things. So in our transcription, we did our best to go back to whatever he wrote. And that seemed to us important. But anyway, at the very bottom it says, indeed, all of my articles have been discoveries and have surprised me. Which is great. And when you read John Burroughs, you'll get that same sort of feeling. The nature essays for which he's most famous are kind of stream of consciousness. You sort of feel like you're walking through the woods with John Burroughs, and whatever he sees, he's going to talk about. And sometimes they kind of double back on each other and on themselves, and you talk about the same thing and that you talked about earlier, just around and around. But that friendly kind of style, I think, is what endeared him to people at the time, made him so popular. Okay, so let's talk then about how we can use those journals and sort of trace. The good thing about having 50 years of journals is that, John Burroughs was a person. And his ideas changed over time, right? And so with having 50 years of journals, we can find what he was thinking in 1870. Was he still thinking the same thing in 1888, 1890, 86, and stuff like that? So I want to talk about one set of articles. It's about the Hudson Valley. It was originally published in 1880, and the title of the essay was Our River. And then 6 years later, when he went to put Our River into a book, he made some big changes to it. And we can see both how those changes came about by reading the two articles side by side, and we can also see how he used his journal and as his ideas were changing. That's another thing, that's another reason I think people felt really comfortable with Burroughs, because he was human in that way. And he'd say something, and then a few years later, if he felt that that wasn't correct, he would correct himself. In fact, in these two essays, this essay and one related to it, he did a lot of correcting. Okay, so we'll trace the development from the journals into the magazine. That's the essay called Our River, and then finally to the book. So here is the magazine article, Our River. You see it was published in Scribner's Monthly, and you can see that, well, there's a lot of print in there, and we're not going to read it all just now, but it was several pages long, 2-column type like that. It was also illustrated with these illustrations I've shown examples of there, and I'll talk about in just a second. The illustrator was named Mary Halleck Foote, and she was from Milton, just down the river here. And that was one of the reasons, I mean, she was a famous engraver at the time, engraver of kind of picturesque scenes. And since she was from the Hudson River, she was a perfect choice for this, because the Hudson River Valley, she was a perfect choice because she grew up with that scenery. At this time, so here, this is actually one paragraph out of all of that two columns of text there that shows what Burroughs was thinking about the Hudson River at the time. So he says, among our watercourses, it stands preeminent. This is the Hudson. The Columbia, called by Major Winthrop the Achilles of rivers, I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but is a more haughty and impetuous stream. The Mississippi is, of course, vastly larger and longer. The St. Lawrence would carry the Hudson as a trophy in his belt and hardly know the difference. Yet, our river is doubtless the most beautiful of them all. It pleases like a mountain lake. And that's so the tone of the article was essentially that, and I'll talk about it in a second. But 6 years later, he had this to say. This is the beginning of the book version of Our River. He called it River View. It says, a small river or stream flowing by one's door has many attractions over a large body of water like the Hudson. One can make a companion of it. He can walk with it, and on like that. But at the very bottom, he says, I think one might spend a lifetime upon its banks, meaning the Hudson, without feeling any sense of ownership in it or becoming at all intimate with it. So in 6 years, he changed his opinions about the Hudson quite a bit. And let's talk about why that is. One of the reasons, I think, is that this is a different kind of an essay for Burroughs. Like I said, most of his essays are like a walk in the woods, and you're walking along with Johnny, and he says, oh, look at that flower, oh, look at that bird, oh, I hear something, like that. All of a sudden, he's talking about a huge landscape. And when he first moved to the Hudson, he was very taken with the picturesque nature of the Hudson, and this essay shows a lot of that. But after a while, it became less, well, as he says up there, it just became less personal to him, like that. So he has these two essays that I want to compare. I'll show you how they developed in parallel. Our River, we already mentioned that. He wrote a similar one about his house, when he built his house, and how wonderful his house was, and how beautiful it was, and how it was going to invite in the domestic spirit, and all these things. And so, but 6 years later, again, his ideas had changed, and they changed. Both of these changed, I think, for the same reason. So here's Our River. He describes all these picturesque things about that: the freeze up, the ice harvesting, ice boating, skating, spring thaw, flooding, hunting, fishing. The interesting thing is, and this is partly his stream of consciousness way of writing, is these aren't in hardly any order at all. In fact, he talks about the ice harvest, and then I think while he's writing that, he thinks, oh, I better say something about when the river froze up in the first place. So rather than put that before the ice harvest, he put it just when he thought of it and stuff. So it's kind of funny that way. He also has a discussion of the geological history of the river, well, which I won't go into unless I have a lot of extra time at the end there. Okay, so this passage here, I want to talk about this passage and the way that it moved essentially from his journals and the way he changed it and why he changed it. So I'll read it. One of the peculiar sounds here is the croaking of the great ice frogs on the river. Rip, rip they go in the still nights, and again when the sun first strikes the ice in the morning. It is a singular sound. Thoreau calls it a whoop, Emerson a cannonade, and again the gasp and moan of the ice-imprisoned flood. Sometimes it reminds me of a huge gong, then of a giant staff beating the air. It seems always in the air and to proceed from something in swift motion. It ricochets like a cannon shot and glances from side to side. It starts sometimes from under your feet and rips or explodes and vanishes in the distance. Then again, it seems like a grunt, as if some great ice god were turning over in his sleep. Phew. Anyway, okay, so on the upper left hand, that's that same thing. That's just a transcription of what I just read there. That is out of his journals, remember. So in the bottom right then, I have the section where he reworked it to put it into our river. And so you can see at the beginning, I mean, if you look at it really quickly, at least you can see where that's kind of indented the gasp and moan of the ice and prison flood. Okay, that's pretty much what he said earlier about Emerson and Thoreau and whoops and stuff like that. And then sometimes it is a well-defined grunt. Okay, he said that in his journal up there. He's as if some ice god turned uneasily in his bed. Then again, I'm reminded of loud croaking, as if some huge ice frogs had come down from the polar regions. Rip they go, now here, now there. One hears it on a still winter night as he sits beside the fire, and again in the morning. Oh, I forgot to get the rest of it there. But anyway, so you get the idea. Everything that was in the journal, he's rearranged it a little bit, but there it is. All right. The engravings of Mary Halleck Foote were used in this. She was known, as I said, she was famous as an engraver of picturesque landscape scenes. She was an admirer of Burroughs, so that was that helped. And she was born and raised in Milton, and though she lived kind of all around the country in her adult life, she was always gravitating toward the Hudson. Her engravings, though, don't really relate to anything that's in the essay. They are there, as I said, she's known for her picturesque, placid landscapes and this kind of feeling of nostalgia, which was very, very strong in the late 19th century. So, for instance, here's the first one, which is called Spring Flood. So spring flood, I mean, you might consider that a spring flood is some sort of disaster and people would be worried and stuff like that. Well, the lady on the horse doesn't look like she's worried about anything. She's just kind of riding down the road there. You can see two guys out there in a boat, but they don't look like they look like they're fishing instead of being worried about a spring flood. So that one, I'm not sure what originally she was illustrating, but it was given the name Spring Flood by the publisher. This one's called The Ice Flow, which I don't know. I can't really see an ice flow in there. I think it was because Burroughs had talked a lot about ice flows, and the publisher wanted to do that. But then we have some that don't have anything to do with anything in the essay. Crossing the ice to the train. I mean, it's a really exciting, engraving. But he never talks about the train, and he never talks about riding horses on the river. This one's called A Bird's Eye View, which I think is interesting because the person sitting there is not looking at the view. She's looking. Some people think this might be a self-portrait, actually, of Mary Halleck Foote, which makes kind of sense. And actually, if you've ever been up to the Catskill Mountain House site, I think this was an illustration from the Catskill Mountain House site. Look how high above the river she is. You don't find that in West Park or Milton or something like that. And then finally, the old cemetery at the Marlborough Landing, which Burroughs did not talk about cemeteries or Marlborough Landing or anything like that. It's a beautiful, beautiful engraving. I really, really like it, but it didn't have anything to do with it. So clearly her stuff was put in there by the magazine to help sell sell issues. And they didn't really illustrate it. Okay, so this was written in 1880, and then in 1886, Burroughs was getting ready to create an anthology of essays, which he was going to call Signs and Seasons. And so he wrote a few things new for Signs and Seasons, but for the most part, he was looking for other essays that he had published. And for some reason, he chose a couple of essays, which were, when he wrote them, one of them is the house building essay, and one of them is Our River. When he wrote them, he was really, really excited, really happy. Happy about his house, happy about the river. By 1886, he found out that his house was really actually a pretty terrible place to live. It was big, it was impractical, it was cold, it was damp, it was built on the side of the hill and into the rock. And his son said that, all through the winter, there was nothing but icicles on the back wall of the house. His wife, Ursula, was a very meticulous housekeeper, and yet Burroughs put the bathroom on the third floor and the kitchen on the first floor. So that meant that whenever anyone wanted to take a bath or use any hot water, they had to carry it up, 2 stories carry hot water up 2 stories of these cramped little stairwells and stuff like that. Anyway, so it wasn't a very nice place. It didn't invite the domestic spirit like he had hoped it would. And also, he felt so on display. He felt so, it was too pretentious for him. And so when he went to redo house building, he retitled it Roof Tree, and then he ends it like this, which I'll try and remember. I'm sorry, it looks like it's a little bit blurry there. Unless, therefore, you have had the rare success of building without pride, it's an important point, your home will offend you by and by and offend others. I think it's interesting to go back and find the essay House Building and see how proud he was of his house. He was doing everything that Andrew Jackson Downing and Calvert Vaux were saying needed to do to create the picturesque landscape and the picturesque building. Perhaps after one has graduated in this school and built 4 or 5 houses, he will have the courage to face the problem squarely and build much more plainly and unpretentiously a low nestling structure of undressed boards or unhewn stone, and be content, I love this line, be content like the oyster with the roughest of shells without, so that to be sure of the mother of pearl within. Which, this was in 1886, and it was still not for 6 or 7 years that he built Slabsides, but this is like a perfect description of Slabsides. They had the rough-hewn boards on the outside, and yet very cozy inside. Okay, so that's what he did. So it's an interesting question. Why would he even bother to pull up this essay from a long time ago that he didn't like and he didn't like it? Why would he revise it and put it into his book? And part of it, I think, is he felt he was a very honest person, and this is what he was feeling, and that's why he put it out there. So he also did some revision to the Our River. Because he was changing his views of the Hudson River. Now, in order to go on, we have to think about what you did as a writer with a pen manuscript back in the 19th century. How do you revise a pen manuscript? And you don't want to write it all over again. He did not have, this was before he had a typewriter, he'd never really learned how to type, but he did have people who would type his essays for him. But this was before that, too. So he had to do it, at that time, he did most of his revisions in probably the easiest way there was. And that was, at the very end of the essay, these are the end of 2 different essays in there, he says, let me conclude this chapter by saying something else. And usually this was in relation to a comment that somebody had written to him about one of his essays when it was published in a magazine. And so he said, okay, well, I'll talk about that. Well, in fact, in Roof Tree, he says, there only remains to be added that. This was a stupid house, and I don't know why I ever built it. And, so he kind of undoes everything in there, but he doesn't really change the essay much. Now, in Our River, he really went at it. And so, literally, he must have cut and pasted stuff. I think he probably got the copy of the magazine and cut and pasted it, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So he cut out sections of it, he rearranged them, probably on the table, and then he wrote new sections in the inside. This is the most extensive revisions we know of any Burroughs essay. Like I say, usually he just said, okay, well, yeah, someone said that, something this, and I'll just add that to the end. No, he did a lot. So here is, it's my copy, so it's pretty messy, but you can see what I've done is I've marked off paragraphs, and I've said what page they end up on in the book. And so here we have two paragraphs next to each other. One of them ended up on page 202, and one ended up on 213. So he was really moving the subject matter around. When I first read that, I thought, he must be doing it. He must be putting things at least in chronological order, which he didn't. I don't know why. And then you see this over here. We have Riverview, page 203. Here's page 200 juxtaposed with 205, 201, like that. He really, this is why I think he must have really actually done what we all are used to doing with the word processor now, the cut and paste. This was real cut and real, he probably didn't even have Scotch tape. He probably used real paste too. Okay, so he did a lot of that. So here's our passage. That we talked about the ice gods and the grunting and the whooping and stuff like that. And this is what it ends up in Riverview. No sooner has the river pulled his icy coverlid over him, than he begins to snore with his winter sleep. It is a singular sound. Thoreau calls it a whoop, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes a well-defined grunt, as if some ice god turned uneasily in his bed. One fancies the sound is like this when he hears it in a still winter night seated by the fireside, or else when snugly wrapped in his own bed. Okay, well, he did away with the frogs. Frogs were one of my favorite part of this whole passage here, but he didn't even put them in there. I guess maybe, I don't know, he felt like, maybe he didn't like frogs anymore or something like that. Then he added new stuff. In his journals, the top of that there was, I won't read it, and this whole presentation is going to be available, right? So if you want to go back and read these, fine, and you can contact me, and I'll send you more information about this. But this is a section which my colleague at Vassar College, Frank Burgon, would call Ovidian. It is taking an observation and making it just very, very strongly imaginative. And so what he's saying is that sometimes the ice flows look like stars and planets and the moon. Sometimes they look like North America, they look like continents moving around like that. He also, and so that, if you notice, the top one out of his journal was written 3 years after the original essay. So these are new observations that he has made. Same thing, here's another one out of his journal at a different time where he's talking about he says on the bottom there's one thing the large river does for one that is beyond the scope of the companionable stream. It idealizes the landscape and multiplies and heightens the beauty of the day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even though he was not really as enamored with the Hudson, he at least found some reason why the large river was a good thing. And I don't want to do that. So over the course of about 15 years, Burroughs went from really feeling proud of his house, feeling, just captivated by the view that he had from that house of the river and everything that happened in the river. And he changed until he wanted to, he felt that it was just too much. He loved this word cloying. It was just something that was just too much. And so he changed to where he wanted the more private life, not exactly a private life with no people visiting him, but at least a private life where he wasn't so exposed as he was at Riverby. And so then in 1895, he built Slabsides, and that was everything. Instead of looking on a big river, it was looking on a swamp. And instead of being exposed, it was really hard to find. If you've ever been there, it's down in a valley like that. And it was much more the way that he was for most of his life. Second here. Oh, doing good. So that's mostly what I'm going to say about the Hudson. Let me just say a few words now about a project that we're doing in the Catskills. Again, based on Burroughs' essays. Mike Kudish is a forest historian based in Arkville, and I've heard it said, people like to say about Mike Kudish is that he knows every tree in the Catskills. He did his PhD on the forest. He wrote a really, really useful book called Catskills, A Forest History, and he studied them a lot since then. And he not only has studied trees, but he studied all of the cultural heritage, essentially, that all the locations of bark tanneries or bark peeler cabins or all kinds of different things. And he knows a lot of different places. Okay, so now John Burroughs was born in the Catskills. If you look at the very top where it says there's a letter 6 and a little line there, that is essentially the area of the homestead that he grew up on. And the 6 is referring to an essay called In the Hemlocks that he wrote about nature ramblings he had around his house there. So each of the colors in here represents a different essay. And I didn't do any of this. Mike did all this. He read the essay, and in the essay, Burroughs talks about landmarks. Well, we saw this big rock here, and we went down that hill, and we came back up. And Mike has figured out where the big rock was, and which hill he went down, and which hill he came back up, and which swamp he was looking at. It's really, really amazing. So the region, basically down in the lower right-hand corner, is the Esopus Creek and West Shokan, that area there. Out on the left-hand side, that's the East Branch of the Delaware, out to Downsville and Hancock, going out that way. Slide Mountain's kind of in the middle, the lower center there. And so, like I say, Mike was able to at least have a pretty good idea about where Burroughs was and on these things. So a couple of these are really fascinating. Burroughs decided that he wanted to climb Slide. He was not the first person to climb Slide, and in fact, a sort of inn owner named James Dutcher had not only built a road to the top of Slide, but had built an observation tower on the top of Slide Mountain. So sometimes people think that Burroughs was the first person and he discovered Slide Mountain. He didn't, but he didn't. He said, well, that way. That's the easy way. It can be essayed by women in their skirts or something like that. He wanted to go the hard way. So the first thing he tried in 1884 was to start on the right-hand side there, West Shokan, and go up and up and up and up. And they got to the top and they looked and they were on top of Wittenberg, not Slide. And they could see Slide. And he said, oh, okay, I'll have to come back for you later. And then they went back down, ended up down near Woodland Valley, where the campground is now. The next year they came, and that's the dashed line starting at the top there, and it comes up, and you see that they kind of went right up in between Slide and Cornell, straight up a pretty steep ascent, and then finally up on the Slide. And then they went down. The way they came down is by the actual slide that gives Slide Mountain its name. What's amazing to me is that in there, when the book comes out, you'll be able to see it, and if you look at the presentation, and zoom in on them, you'll see there's all kinds of things. Well, here was so-and-so's bark cabin, and here was so-and-so's farm and stuff. Things that are long gone, but Mike has been able to find them, and it's really, really been fascinating to work with that. Basically, the way the book works is that Mike writes a sort of a forest history of where Burroughs was, and then I am looking at the essays. Like this one is called In the Heart of the Southern Catskills. I'm looking at that essay and trying to, do sort of a little bit of literary criticism on that. Now, Burroughs, I mean, first of all, this shows that Burroughs, well, of course, this was long before there were trails. The DEC was not building trails for them to go up. They had to bushwhack up there. And there weren't really very good maps either. And so I think it's understandable, you stand down by, down in West Shokan and say, well, if I want to get to the highest mountain around here, I must just start walking uphill. And so they walked uphill. But then to find out that they weren't on slide, that was disappointing. Well, I just want to talk about one other of these essays because it's really, this one I think is the best detective story of the whole time. So he was trying to find this lake in the bottom right-hand corner. Right now it's called Thomas's Lake, but at the time it was called Beecher Lake. And it was named for, I believe, the uncle or the father of Harry Beecher Stowe that had land down there. So anyway, they started at the top, and they kind of came down and over to the left-hand side, and they walked along this ridge, Millbrook Ridge. So there's a dashed line or dotted line that goes across there. And so they got onto Millbrook Ridge, and they thought, well, okay, well, we're on the ridge here. We need to just go down, and we'll find the lake. So the first thing they did is go down a stream going exactly the wrong direction. They must not have had a compass with them, and came back up. Well, then Burroughs said, okay, let's just have one of us go look around. I'm going to go find the lake. So he went on the far right there. Sorry, I wish this thing would work here. He whacked down and he found Beecher Lake. Good fishing and stuff like that. Nice. He went back up and found his friends. They said, it's just down here. But then they found a little row of trees that had been blazed. And they said, well, this must be the trail. And it wasn't. And it led them all the way out to the west. They went all the way out through a bunch of alder swamps and stuff. Finally, they figured, this isn't it. They went back, and then they finally got down to Beecher Lake. So it's really, Burroughs is so good at laughing at himself when he writes about these things. It is really, really amusing to read these. But anyway, so this book had a little bit of a sort of COVID delay. We hope in the next year or so it's mostly all done. We just need to finish the introduction. And Cornell University Press said they'll publish it, but now we have to get it done and stuff like that. But anyway, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. Are there any questions people have? Yes, sir.
What was the deal between John Burroughs and his wife, Ursula? Seemed like she was perpetually annoyed with him. Was it because he built such a lousy house for her?
I'm sure that didn't help. Part of the reason is that Burroughs was really gregarious, okay, and he was such a friendly person that anybody could walk up to his house and start talking to him, and he would talk to them. There's a story about this school teacher who came from Boston, and she showed up at his house, and she stayed for a week. And Burroughs just took her out every day and showed her all the birds and stuff like that. It's just amazing. And then Clara Barris wrote a book called Our Friend John Burroughs, and essentially said to anybody who wants, you just stop by and see it. Well, Ursula, like I said, she's a meticulous housekeeper, and it was really disruptive to that. Part of the reason he built Slabsides was that at least he could take people over there, and then get away from his wife. Well, not exactly get away from the wife, but not make it so she didn't have to feel like she had to cook for all these people, and and find places for them to stay and stuff like that. But so it was he was very, very friendly that way. Yes.
Is open only one day a year? Who owns Slabsides?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I meant to mention that. It's owned by the John Burroughs Association. No, the John Burroughs Association. There's also a John Burroughs Natural History Society, and they don't own it. The John Burroughs Association. So if you have to Google that as all but one big word, johnburroughsassociation.org. It's open twice a year, regularly. And that's on the first Saturday of October or the third Saturday in May. And these are called Slabsides Days. And if you go to the John Burroughs Association website, you can see when the next time it's open. You can get on the mailing list, and then they'll tell you that. There also now are lots, like we did a ramble there just recently, and the president of the association was there, and she opened the cabin for the people who came on the ramble and stuff like that. So it's open other times, but the regular times are the 2 Slabsides days. And I would encourage you, I meant to put that address up here, but I didn't. JohnBurroughsAssociation.org, and they do nature walks. They do a ramble every weekend of the ramble. They had a ramble going, and then they have these open houses on Slabsides Day. Yes, sir. You can use the trails anytime. Yes, every single day. There's parking. There's 2 entrances to it. One on Burroughs Drive, I think it's called, and then one right off of Floyd Acker. And you can walk the trails there. There's maybe 4 or 5 miles of trails, and most of them are pretty new and in really, really good shape, so they're good. Yes, sure.
Former teacher took my kids up there to Slabsides.
Yep.
We did a lot of cleaning up there. We got in to see Slabsides and we saw lots of things. His niece, granddaughter.
Betty Kelly.
Yes.
Yes.
She's
No, Joan Burroughs. Joan Burroughs is the great granddaughter.
I have a cache. My kids geocache there.
Yeah, I was going to say that when you said you're going to do geocaching. I hear there's one there.
If you want to go to Slabsides and see it, then come to our geocaching thing next month. All about geocaching.
Yeah.
And then you can go visit Slabsides. I
Right.
told you it's all connected.
It's all connected.
All
Right.
connected.
And can we all get lost?
No,
Yeah.
no, the trails are really good actually. Yeah, they're really good trails. So that
They're
was
very-
the first, that was the first cache, and my kids did that. Oh, it must be 10 years ago now. I
Wow.
started about 10 years ago.
Nice.
And now I see there's another 4 caches by another association.
Oh,
So we
at
have to
the
go
same.
right.
The Girl Scouts. Okay.
Yeah.
Very
So
good.
if anybody come next month, then we'll make a trip to Slabsides.
That'd be
and
great.
find the geocaches.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I did a geology walk there, explain the geology of the sanctuary. They have naturalists that talk about, they talk about lichens, they talk about mosses, they talk about worms, they talk about vernal pools and birds and just kind of all kinds of stuff. It's a great place. What's that? Yep, Sanctuary Pond is really, really beautiful. Any other questions? Yes? So I didn't publish a book. What I did was I republished the book called Science and Seasons. And so I basically, in 1886, Burroughs collected all these essays and put them in a book called Science and Seasons. And then what I did was I added an introduction, and I added little introductions to each of the essays to kind of explain where they came from and stuff like that. So it was published by Syracuse University Press. And so I think if you looked at Syracuse University Press for Science and Seasons, you could find it. It's still available. I still get my $10 royalty check. It's a big seller. Yes. What's that? Oh, that one's going to be published by, that'll be really good. That's going to be Cornell University Press. We don't have a title for it exactly yet. Like I say, most of the stuff is done, but deciding on the title and writing the introduction and stuff like that is we're still working on it and hope that'll happen. And having to redraft the maps. Mike is an amazing draftsperson, freehand draftsperson. But the press wants us to have, professionally done maps. So they're redoing his maps. I think, is that good? Okay, thank you.